Okay, in this section, we are going to be looking at the spinal cord from a few different perspectives. So here, it's important to understand that a lot of students think that the spinal cord starts at the base of the skull and goes all the way down to the coccyx, and that's really furthest thing from the truth. The spinal cord does begin at the base of the neck, right through the magnum foramen, but the spinal cord ends here between L1 and L2 interspace at an area that we call the conus medullaris right here. The conus medullaris is where the spinal cord tapers down and it kind of looks like the apex of an ice cream cone, right? It comes down to an apex like that. That is the conus medullaris. So the spinal cord ends at L1, L2, which is why whenever there is an epidural that's given or they need to sample cerebral spinal fluid, they'll always inject below the L2. So somewhere between L3, L4, L5 is where they'll inject to sample cerebral spinal fluid. Why? Because there's no spinal cord here. The worst thing that may happen is a needle may hit a spinal nerve, but not the spinal cord itself. Up in the neck, we have 8 pairs of cranial nerves, and there is the brachial plexus and the cervical plexus that exists in the neck. So it's an area that becomes enlarged due to the complexity of those nerves. We can also see that in the thoracic spine, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. 12 pairs of cranial nerves. And then in the sacral area, there's an area called the cauda equina, which really means horse's tail. It really looks like the tail of a horse. I also want you to be familiar with the meninges. There are 3 layers of meninges, the pia mater, the arachnoid, and the dura mater. What we see here, the outermost layer closest to the vertebra itself, is the dura mater right here. And just deep, we could see this arrow, the layer that's just next to it is the arachnoid matter. And the innermost layer to the spinal cord would be the pia mater. So there's the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Let's scroll up a little bit more. Let's look at the close-up view. Here's the L1 vertebra, here's L2, and somewhere between the L1 and L2, we see the spinal cord tapering off to be referred to as the conus medullaris. And then there is an extension of that that comes all the way down called the filum terminale, which is that center line, and the filum terminale is that center line. And the rest of the neurological uh, nerve endings down in the sacrum is the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Here, a close-up look at the neck. We can see the cervical nerves. These are spinal nerves. Here's the cervical enlargement due to the brachial plexus and the cervical plexus. Here's a close-up view of the dura mater, which is blue. That's number 17. Number 16 is the arachnoid. And the pia mater would be the layer that is just superficial to the spinal cord. We'll take a look at the meninges from this cross section here. So here's the spinal cord. Here's a cervical vertebrae. We know it's a cervical because it's a bifid spinous process. And when we zoom in here, we'll see that here are these 2 indentations, one in the back, one in the front. On the back, we have the PMS, the posterior median sulcus, and in the front, we have the AMF, which is the anterior median fissure. Okay. Let's look at the next one. Here are the 3 meningeal layers. So we have PAD, 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 pia mater, arachnoid, and dura. Closest to the spinal cord is the pia mater. Then we go a little bit external to that, right here is the arachnoid layer, looks like number 16. And then this one, it looks like number 9, that's the dura mater, which is the external layer. So you have PAD, PAD. Now we also have some spaces between them. You can see there's a subarachnoid space, a subdural space, and an epidural space. So this larger space here between the pia and the arachnoid is called the subarachnoid space. And in the subarachnoid space is where we have cerebral spinal fluid that flows. So cerebral spinal fluid flows here. The subdural space is right here. It's this thin line right here that's just under the dura mater, right? Here's dura, here's arachnoid, here's pia. Above the dura mater is the epidural space. Epidural. That's filled with fat and adipose. It adds to cushioning of the spinal cord. Okay. This is a ligament right here. This is called a posterior longitudinal ligament. This is the vertebral body. And you know what sits on the body is a disc. So when the disc bulges or herniates in some people that have herniated discs, it can push back and it hits the PLL, the posterior longitudinal ligament, which has so many sensory and afferent neurons that pick up pain signals. So before the disc actually hits the spinal cord, it hits this ligament first, and it's highly pain sensitive. Okay, when we look at the cord itself, in the center is gray matter, and surrounding it, all of this is white matter. So the butterfly or the letter H in the middle is gray matter, and everything around it is white matter. So we have different horns that we can find here. And since the spinous process is posterior, this is the posterior horn. Because the vertebral body is anterior, this is the anterior horn. And what we have on the lateral side is the lateral horn. So in the gray matter, we have horns, a dorsal horn or posterior horn, an anterior horn or ventral horn, and then we have a lateral horn. The horizontal crossbar of the butterfly or the letter H is called a gray commissure. And right in the center is a hole where cerebral spinal fluid flows called a central canal. Now we covered the horns. We said we had a dorsal horn, a ventral horn, and a lateral horn. The white matter is not made of horns. The white matter is made up of columns. So you'll see we have a posterior column. We have an anterior column. And then we have lateral columns. So the columns represent the white matter surrounding the gray matter. So again, on the back side is the posterior or dorsal white column. On the lateral side is the lateral white column. And in the front on both sides is the anterior or ventral white column. The white columns, whether it's posterior, anterior, or lateral, is where all of your tracks lie. In lecture, you're going to learn tracks as motor tracks or sensory tracks, tracks that will act as the upward elevator or downward elevator. The upward elevator carries information up to the brain, and the downward elevator carries motor information away from the brain. And this highway of communication up and down has to ride up what we call tracks. Some tracks are sensory, they go up to the brain. Some tracks are motor, they go down from the brain. And all of those tracks lie in the white columns. In terms of the nerves off of the spinal cord, we can see one of the major structures that we can see off the nerve is this ganglia. A ganglia is really just a group of nerve cell bodies in the peripheral neural system. That's what a ganglia is. It's a cluster. So wherever you see this large cluster, that's called the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia. So if this is the dorsal root ganglia, that's bringing information into the dorsal root, which is here. And then here are the rootlets. It's a little bit mislabeled, but you can see the rootlets are these small extensions. These are dorsal rootlets. This is the dorsal root, and this is the dorsal root ganglia. On the other side, this is your anterior root, and these are your anterior rootlets. The rootlets are just smaller filaments of those neurons. Okay, so again, sensory information comes in the back, motor information goes out the front. Sensory information comes in through the dorsal root ganglia. Let me zoom out a little bit so you can see it. So sensory input comes in through the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia, into the dorsal root, into the dorsal rootlets, comes into the dorsal horn, right? And then motor information comes out from the anterior horn to the anterior rootlets to the anterior root. So a spinal nerve is a mixed nerve because it has sensory and motor. So if a herniated disc is putting pressure on an anterior root, you're going to have motor weakness. There's going to be weakness to muscles. If the disc is putting pressure and it hits the sensory part, that's where you have pain and numbness and tingling. So dorsal roots and ventral roots carry different information. Dorsal roots carry sensory input. Ventral roots carry motor output. So right here is the spinal nerve. And I said a spinal nerve is mixed because it's composed of dorsal root and ventral root, sensory and motor component. Don't confuse dorsal root and ventral root with dorsal ramus and ventral ramus. Look how much larger the ventral ramus is, or the anterior ramus. It is the anterior ramus. It's the anterior ramus that delivers or contributes to the plexus, whether it's the cervical plexus in the neck, the brachial plexus in the neck, the lumbar plexus in the lower back, or the sacral plexus of the lower back. All of those plexus come from these branches called the ventral rami. The dorsal rami give distribution to the muscles of the back and the skin of the back. Okay, so that brings a close to that. Let me take a look at this one again. Let me just see if there's anything different here that I want to show you. Okay, we covered this already. We covered that. Let's look at flat Stanley for a second. So what I was trying to explain is that we have a cervical enlargement in the neck because we have cervical plexus and brachial plexus in the neck. The cervical plexus goes up and the brachial plexus goes down into the arm. In the lower back, there's another enlargement because we have the lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. And when we look at the brachial plexus, we do have nerves that come off of it, like the axillary nerve, musculocutaneous nerve, radial nerve, ulnar, and median. Those are really the terminal branches of the brachial plexus. And in the cervical plexus, we have a list of these other nerves up here. I think the biggie of the cervical plexus is that phrenic nerve, because the phrenic nerve goes to your diaphragm and it controls your breathing. But these other nerves, like axillary, musculocutaneous, radial, ulnar, and median, these nerves control the muscles of the upper extremity. So if you have decreased strength, it could be because there's interference to these terminal branches of the brachial plexus. And then in the lumbar and sacral plexus, we have a bunch of other nerves. And of course, the most famous one being the sciatic nerve that comes off of the sacral plexus here. So let's look at flat Stanley, where we can see a bunch of nerves coming off of it. Let's go back down here. So in the neck, we have a cervical plexus, right? That's this group of nerves here that want to go up. And then off the cervical plexus is this nerve called the phrenic nerve that goes to your diaphragm. What we see going downward into the arm and shoulder, that's the brachial plexus. So here's the brachial plexus that goes from C5 to T1. That's C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 nerve root. And then you have these terminal branches here, axillary nerve, musculocutaneous, radial, ulnar, and median. These go to the entire upper extremity. So here in the neck is your brachial plexus. Those are the major contributory nerves that go down to the entire upper extremity. If we were to break them down, going into the armpit, that's your axillary nerve. Axillary nerve controls your deltoid and your teres minor muscle. The deltoid and teres minor. Here's your musculocutaneous nerve. That one there goes to your biceps, brachii, and your brachialis. Most of your elbow flexors are musculocutaneous. Then going down into the forearm, right, you have a ulnar nerve that's following the ulnar bone. You have a radial nerve following the radial bone. And then in between both is the median nerve. It's kind of in the middle. And all of these nerves, the ulnar, radial, and median, are going to go to all of those forearm muscles and intrinsic finger muscles. The majority of the wrist flexors are controlled by the median nerve. Few of them are ulnar nerve. All of the wrist extensors and all of the finger extensors, anything that deals with extension, is radial nerve. Anything that extends the elbow, extends the wrist, extends the fingers, is always radial nerve innervation. The thoracic spine doesn't have a plexus. It just has spinal nerves, and they're called intercostal nerves. They just go to the muscles between the ribs. The lumbar and sacral plexus are important, but let's show you what the intercostal nerves look like. These go to the muscles between the ribs, and they're called intercostals. And again, there's 12 pairs on each side. 12 pairs on each side. Let's look down a little bit lower into the lumbar region. That's the lumbar plexus. And there's two main nerves that come off the lumbar plexus. There's the femoral nerve, which is here. And then there's the obturator nerve here. The obturator nerve goes to most of the muscles on the inner thigh, like the adductor longus, adductor magnus, adductor brevis, pectineus, gracilis. Anything on the inside compartment has to come from a nerve that's near that obturator foramen, right? That's the obturator nerve. The femoral nerve is going to go to your quads, the quadricep muscles. Lower than that is the sacral plexus, and here we have the infamous sciatic nerve. It's the largest, thickest nerve of the body. When we look at the sciatic nerve, right, here's the patella, here's the femur, patella, tibia, and fibular. So in this view here, we're rotating the foot laterally, so it gives us a better view of what's posterior. And you can see the sciatic nerve at the back of the knee, it splits. In the front of the knee, in the front of the tibia, is the deep peroneal nerve. That goes to all of your dorsiflexors. And on the posterior side is the posterior tibial nerve. From the front view, there's your deep peroneal nerve. And on the lateral side is the superficial peroneal nerve. So the superficial peroneal nerve is going to go control sensation to the outer leg, and it's also going to control the peroneus sisters, peroneus longus and peroneus brevis muscle. The deep peroneal nerve controls all of the anterior compartment muscles of the leg that dorsiflex the foot. The posterior tibial nerve controls the gastrocnemius and the soleus. It does plantar flexion of the feet. Okay, spinal cord reflex. Okay, this is just, there's usually a few questions on lecture and lab that come from what's called the reflex arc. And there's a few different components of a reflex arc. There's usually 5, and you can see them numbered here. Number 1, there has to be a receptor that receives some sort of painful stimulus. You're activating the receptor. Then the information has to go through a sensory neuron, which is this. The sensory neuron comes in right through the dorsal horn. And then here, there is a processing neuron. It's also called an interneuron or an association neuron. That's right here in the gray matter. This is an interneuron or an association neuron. It's basically processing the sensory information that came in, and then it's going to send it to the anterior horn, to the ventral root, out to the actual muscle, which is the effector. So you have a receptor, number 1, sensory neuron, number 2, interneuron or association neuron, number 3, a motor neuron or ventral root, number 4, and then the effector, number 5. What that would look like in the plaque would look like this. So let's say a thumbtack hits the skin or the epidermis of the skin. So we have pain receptors here. Then we have this yellow neuron coming up. That's your sensory neuron. This is your dorsal root ganglia, right? That swollen part. Here's your dorsal horn, which is gray matter. Here's your ventral horn, gray matter. So you have sensory neuron, which is yellow, and it relays it to the interneuron. They call it an integrating neuron. It's more appropriate to refer to this as an interneuron or an association neuron. And all the interneuron is a relay man, right? If you're in a relay race and you're handing the baton to the next runner, that's what the interneuron is doing. It is taking the sensory input that came in and is relaying the motor command to this guy here. And that's your motor neuron. And the last part of the motor neuron is the effector. Okay, so you have receptors, number 1, sensory neuron, number 2, interneuron, number 3, motor neuron, number 4, effector, number 5. And when the effector, number 5, is stimulated, boom, the hand moves away from the painful stimulus. And that's the reflex arc. Okay, let me make sure we covered everything. And I think we did. We covered more than I want. Oh, the very, very last thing is just the neuron that I wanted to cover with you. And when we look at a neuron, generally speaking, you have dendrites, which are out here. That brings sensory information into the soma, which is the cell body. And then you could see the arrow moving in this direction. It moves the information into an axon. And at the very end of the axon, we have what's called axon terminals, which is where your neurotransmitters are. And those neurotransmitters will release either an excitatory neurotransmitter or an inhibitory neurotransmitter, depending on whether you want an excitatory message or an inhibitory message. So when we look at this here, this section right here was cut from here, right? So all they did was cut this axon from here so that they're sitting side by side. But in your visualization, this part would have been an extension of the axon. So what do we have? We have these gray extensions or branches that are called dendrites. Those are important. We have the cell body known as the soma. There's the nucleus within. There's an axon hillock which is the dilated part of the axon, and the initial segment, sometimes they call it the trigger zone, that's where the action potential initiates and the neurological message is sent out through the axon. And the axons are covered or protected by what we call myelin. So right here, we see this is the myelin sheath that is produced by the Schwann cell. This is myelin here. This is myelin here. The axons are in the center that is protected by the myelin sheath. Each of these is a Schwann cell that produce this myelin. What separates this Schwann cell from this Schwann cell is this little indentation called the node of Ranvier. The node of Ranvier is where two Schwann cells kind of get very close to each other, and the action potential is driven down through the myelin and jumps to the next Schwann cell. And it moves rapid to the next Schwann cell, and it jumps again. Okay, they call that saltatory conduction, which means leaping or jumping of the neurological messages. This is just a nucleus, as is this is a nucleus of a Schwann cell. Okay, and another view of the same thing as a continuous, one continuous structure. Let's make it a little bit larger there. Okay, so we see the dendrites, which means branches of a tree. We do see the nucleus in the center. This is the soma, or the cell body. Here is the axon hillock, which is the dilated part, the initial segment where the action potential originates. These are axons right down the center, and it's protected and insulated by the myelin sheath, which is produced by the Schwann cell. Right here is the node of Ranvier. So the action potential is driven down, and then it jumps to the next Schwann cell. It leaps at the node of Ranvier. Just a close-up view. These are dendrites. These extensions are the axon terminals. Those are axon terminals. Here is the axon hillock, the dilated part. Here is the initial segment, and these are axons. Here is the myelin sheath that's produced by the Schwann cell. Here's the nucleus of the Schwann cell. That's the node of Ranvier right here. If I didn't name the structure, it means I'm not going to hold you accountable for it. Okay. Here are the axon terminals once again. They call them axosomatic synapse, but it's really the axon terminals. This structure here is called the endoneurium. It's that kind of like endomysium, epimysium, perimysium. Here surrounding the axon is an endoneurium right here. You could see the endoneurium here as well. Okay.